Imagine a world where the rich get richer simply by staying rich, while the rest work harder just to keep up. Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century dives into this unsettling reality, unraveling why wealth and power often concentrate at the top. By tracing centuries of data, Piketty reveals a simple yet powerful truth. And what does it mean for the rest of us? As Piketty traces the rise and fall of inequality across history, he raises urgent questions about the future of capitalism, democracy, and fairness. Could this be the key to understanding why the gap between rich and poor keeps growing? Or are we too late to rewrite the story? One of the most profound insights from Capital in the 21st century is Thomas Piketty's equation R greater than G, which illustrates how the rate of return on capital, R, exceeds the rate of economic growth, G. This seemingly simple concept has far-reaching implications, as it explains why wealth tends to concentrate in the hands of a few over time. To understand this, let's break it down. Capital refers to assets like real estate, stocks, bonds, or business ownership, anything that generates income over time. Historically, the returns on these assets, such as rental income, dividends, or capital gains, have outpaced the growth of the economy as a whole. For example, if an economy grows at 2% annually, but the returns on capital average 5%, those who own the capital accumulate wealth much faster than the rest of the population. This dynamic isn't just a modern phenomenon, it's deeply rooted in history. Piketty provides extensive data showing that in agrarian economies of the 18th and 19th centuries, landowners amassed wealth far faster than workers could ever hope to through wages. Similarly, during the Industrial Revolution, factory owners and investors saw exponential gains in wealth, while workers faced low wages and limited upward mobility. This pattern of inequality persisted well into the 20th century, only disrupted temporarily by the shocks of two world wars and the Great Depression, which destroyed significant amounts of wealth and forced governments to redistribute resources through progressive taxation and welfare policies. However, as those disruptive forces faded, the pattern of R greater than G reemerged. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, globalization and technological advancements made it easier for the wealthy to diversify their investments and achieve high returns, while wage growth for the average worker stagnated. For instance, billionaires today often derive their wealth not from active labor, but from the compounding returns on their vast portfolios of assets. A single well-placed investment can generate more income in a year than the lifetime earnings of an average worker. The consequences of this dynamic are immense. First, it creates a cycle of inherited wealth, where family fortunes grow across generations without much effort from their heirs. This leads to an oligarchic society, where wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of a few, undermining meritocracy and equal opportunity. Over time, this concentration of wealth can erode democratic institutions, as the rich gain disproportionate influence over policymaking, often shaping laws to protect their interests and perpetuate their advantages. Second, the gap between the wealthy and the rest of society widens, creating economic and social tensions. When the majority of people feel that hard work and innovation cannot lead to meaningful progress, resentment builds. This inequality isn't just unfair, it's also inefficient. When wealth is concentrated in a few hands, it limits consumption and investment by the broader population, slowing overall economic growth. Moreover, relying on economic growth alone to combat inequality is not sufficient. Piketty shows that even during periods of rapid growth, such as post-World War II, inequality can persist if the returns on capital remain higher than wage increases. This insight challenges the long-held belief that free markets naturally resolve inequality over time. Instead, Piketty argues that structural interventions, such as progressive taxation, inheritance taxes, and policies promoting wealth redistribution, are essential to counteract the natural tendency of wealth to concentrate. This lesson is a wake-up call for policymakers, economists, and society as a whole. It reveals that the mechanisms driving inequality are deeply embedded in the economic system and will not self-correct. Understanding the forces behind R greater than G is crucial for addressing the growing disparities in wealth and ensuring that economic systems work for everyone, not just those at the top. Inequality has been a persistent feature of human societies, but its nature and causes have shifted over time. In Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty highlights how the mechanisms behind inequality have transformed from being largely tied to land ownership in pre-industrial societies to being driven by capital and financial markets in modern economies. Understanding this evolution is key to grasping why inequality persists and how it manifests today. In pre-industrial societies, wealth was primarily concentrated in the hands of landowners. Agriculture dominated the economy, and land was the most valuable resource. Those who owned vast estates could generate wealth without actively working, relying on rents from tenants or the produce of their land. This form of inequality was highly visible and rigid. Inheritance laws and social hierarchies ensured that wealth remained within elite families for generations. The Industrial Revolution brought significant economic changes, shifting wealth creation from land to industry. Factories, machinery, and industrial capital became the new sources of wealth. While this transition created opportunities for new industrialists and entrepreneurs, it also reinforced inequality. Capital accumulation remained concentrated, as those who could invest in industrial ventures reaped the benefits of economic growth. At the same time, workers faced low wages and limited upward mobility, highlighting a recurring pattern. The benefits of economic progress are rarely evenly distributed. In the 20th century, the two world wars and the Great Depression disrupted this cycle of inequality. These global shocks destroyed vast amounts of wealth, especially in Europe, and created opportunities for more equitable policies. Progressive taxation, social welfare programs, and public investment in education and infrastructure helped reduce inequality, particularly in the post-World War II era. During this period, strong economic growth and government intervention enabled a more balanced distribution of wealth and income, leading to what many regard as a golden age of reduced inequality in Western economies. However, this period was an anomaly rather than the norm. By the late 20th century, inequality began to rise again, driven by new factors. Globalization and technological advancements created immense opportunities for capital owners while putting downward pressure on wages, particularly for low and middle-skilled workers. Financial markets played a central role in this new era of inequality. The ability to invest in global markets, benefit from tax loopholes, and leverage wealth to generate even higher returns created a stark divide between the rich and the rest. In modern times, inherited wealth has also made a strong comeback. Piketty demonstrates that in wealthy nations, particularly in Europe, the share of inherited wealth as a percentage of total wealth is approaching levels last seen in the 19th century. This resurgence challenges the notion of meritocracy and raises questions about the fairness of economic systems. This lesson underscores the fact that inequality is deeply embedded in the structure of economies. While its drivers may change, from land ownership to industrial capital to financial markets, the underlying dynamic remains consistent. Those who control the most valuable resources or assets tend to accumulate wealth faster than those who rely on labor alone. Piketty argues that inherited wealth, once thought to be a relic of aristocratic societies, is once again playing a dominant role in modern economies. This resurgence challenges the meritocratic ideals that many democracies hold dear and raises critical questions about fairness, opportunity, and the future of social mobility. Historically, the concentration of wealth through inheritance was most visible in pre-industrial Europe, where elite families passed down land and fortunes for generations. In these societies, a person's economic status was largely determined by the family they were born into, rather than their abilities or efforts. However, the 20th century saw a decline in the significance of inherited wealth due to the destruction caused by wars, economic crises, and the rise of progressive taxation policies. These disruptions leveled the playing field to some extent, allowing more people to accumulate wealth through labor and entrepreneurship. Yet, as Piketty shows, the decline of inherited wealth was temporary. In recent decades, it has returned as a major force in shaping economic inequality, particularly in wealthy nations. The reasons for this are twofold. First, the accumulation of capital has outpaced economic growth, leading to greater concentrations of wealth among the already wealthy. Second, lower taxation on wealth and inheritance in many countries has allowed family fortunes to grow unchecked, enabling the wealthy to pass down significant resources to their heirs. To illustrate this, Piketty examines the share of inherited wealth in France, where it now accounts for more than 50% of total wealth, a level similar to the 19th century. A similar trend is observed in other developed economies, where inheritances and gifts from family members have become a critical factor in determining an individual's financial standing. This phenomenon has profound implications for social mobility, as it means that the opportunities available to individuals are increasingly determined by their family's wealth rather than their own efforts or abilities. The resurgence of inherited wealth creates a feedback loop of inequality. Wealthy families can afford to invest in the best education, healthcare, and connections for their children, further cementing their socioeconomic status. Meanwhile, those born into less wealthy families face significant barriers to climbing the economic ladder. This dynamic undermines the idea of equal opportunity, replacing it with a system where privilege and advantage are inherited rather than earned. The concentration of inherited wealth also poses risks to democracy. Wealthy individuals and families often wield disproportionate influence over political systems, using their resources to lobby for policies that protect their interests, such as lower taxes on wealth and capital gains. This influence can erode trust in democratic institutions, as ordinary citizens perceive that the system is skewed in favor of the elite. Addressing this issue requires bold policy interventions. Piketty advocates for progressive inheritance taxes and wealth taxes to counteract the concentration of wealth and ensure that opportunities are more evenly distributed. These measures aim to break the cycle of inequality and create a society where success is determined by talent and effort, not by birthright. Education has often been touted as the great equalizer, providing individuals with the opportunity to rise above their socioeconomic circumstances. It alone is not enough to significantly reduce inequality. The assumption that access to education can bridge the gap between the rich and the poor is, according to Piketty, overly simplistic. True equality requires deeper structural changes in how wealth and power are distributed. Education undeniably plays an important role in individual success. In theory, improving access to education, particularly higher education, should give people the tools to increase their earning potential, innovate, and contribute to economic growth. Over the course of the 20th century, many countries made significant strides in expanding access to education, leading to higher rates of literacy and college graduation. For a period, this seemed to support the idea that education could level the playing field and create a more egalitarian society. However, Piketty argues that the relationship between education and income inequality is more complicated than it first appears. While education can help individuals secure higher-paying jobs, it does not fundamentally change the underlying structure of economic systems where wealth is already heavily concentrated. The key problem is that education cannot by itself overcome the broader forces driving inequality, particularly the concentration of wealth through capital. One of the major issues is the rising cost of education, particularly in countries like the United States, where tuition fees at top universities have skyrocketed in recent decades. As education becomes more expensive, it increasingly becomes a privilege reserved for the wealthy. This creates a cycle where those with wealth can afford to send their children to the best schools, ensuring that they maintain their social and economic advantage. Meanwhile, lower-income families struggle to afford quality education, limiting their children's opportunities and perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Moreover, education in itself does not directly address the more systemic issues of capital accumulation. While education can improve an individual's earning potential, it does not solve the fundamental issue of wealth inequality, where returns on capital far outpace wages. In societies with extreme inequality, the rich often see their wealth grow far faster than wages could ever catch up, even for the most educated individuals. Piketty also points out that educational systems often reinforce existing inequalities. For example, schools in wealthier areas tend to have better resources, more experienced teachers, and better educational outcomes. In contrast, schools in poorer areas struggle with overcrowding, underfunding, and lower quality education. As a result, the educational system often mirrors the broader inequalities in society, offering advantages to those who are already privileged. In addition, the focus on education as a primary means of reducing inequality can divert attention from the more pressing structural issues at play. The true drivers of inequality are the economic systems that allow wealth to accumulate and concentrate in the hands of a few, systems that do not change simply because more people are educated. Without addressing these systemic issues, such as by reforming tax systems, regulating financial markets, or creating policies that promote wealth redistribution, education alone cannot bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. One of the most important and striking lessons in Capital in the 21st century is the connection between wealth and political power. Piketty argues that the concentration of wealth not only creates economic inequality, but also consolidates political power, which in turn perpetuates and exacerbates that inequality. The idea that money and power are intertwined is not new, but Piketty provides extensive evidence to show how, throughout history, the wealthy have used their resources to shape political systems in their favor, often at the expense of democracy and social equality. At the heart of this lesson is the idea that wealth is not just a passive force in society, it is actively used to influence the political process. Piketty draws on historical examples to demonstrate how the wealthy have consistently sought to protect their privileges by shaping laws, policies, and institutions to their advantage. For instance, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the concentration of wealth among the aristocracy and industrial elites led to the creation of laws that favored property rights, lowered taxes on the wealthy, and allowed capital to accumulate without significant redistribution. In the post-World War II period, as many countries implemented progressive taxation systems and social welfare programs, the balance of power shifted, and the political influence of the wealthy was temporarily curtailed. However, as global wealth inequality began to rise again in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, so too did the political influence of the richest individuals and corporations. This resurgence of economic inequality coincides with the rise of lobbying, political donations, and corporate influence on government policies. The wealthiest members of society have increasingly been able to influence elections, shape policy decisions, and even challenge regulatory frameworks that might limit their ability to accumulate wealth. Piketty highlights how this concentration of political power leads to a vicious cycle. The wealthier the elite becomes, the more they can manipulate the political system to ensure policies that benefit them, such as tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, and policies that favor capital accumulation over wage growth. As a result, the political system becomes skewed in favor of the wealthy, further entrenching economic inequality. The political influence of wealth also leads to a reduction in social mobility, as laws and policies are crafted to maintain the status quo, limiting the chances for the broader population to access the resources and opportunities needed to improve their lives. A key example of this dynamic is the increasing trend of tax cuts for the rich. Over the past few decades, in countries like the United States, tax rates on the wealthiest individuals and corporations have steadily declined. Piketty argues that this has been driven not only by economic ideology, but also by the political power that the wealthy have accumulated. By using their vast resources to fund political campaigns and lobby for favorable policies, the rich have effectively secured tax breaks that allow them to accumulate even more wealth while shifting the tax burden onto the middle and lower classes. This concentration of political power also erodes the democratic process. When a small group of wealthy individuals or corporations control much of the political agenda, the political system becomes less responsive to the needs of the broader population. Citizens may feel disconnected from the political process, believing that their votes do not matter in the face of corporate donations and political lobbying. This undermines the legitimacy of democracy itself and fosters a sense of disenchantment and inequality among the general public.